My topic is economics of nuclear power plants. I'm going to show you some recent trends and some future trends. This is work done mostly with my colleagues Claudia Kempfert from DRW and Christian von Hirschhausen, but also some parts are from the current World Nuclear Industry Status Report with Michael Schneider, where I'm one of the contributing authors. So a quick overview of the agenda. I'm going to show you some global trends. Then, as I am an economist, I'm going to talk about the market, the demand side of the nuclear power market and the supply side. And finally, I'm going to show some perspectives, economic perspectives of nuclear power, and conclude afterwards. So to start, I find it always useful to, when talking about nuclear power, to first start by looking back. This talk, now the conference is called Nuclear Power as a Climate Solution. This talk that nuclear power as a technological fix is quite old. We go back to when President Eisenhower announced in his Atoms for Peace strategy that nuclear power will diffuse rapidly. It's economic. This was echoed also by Levi Strauss in his famous quote in 1954 that nuclear power is going to, the children of ours will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter. But it took only 3 years. In 1957, we have the first commercial demonstration reactor, shipping port, and the dream shattered. Although it was called commercial, it was 8 times more expensive than the competitors. We did for the DRW analysis of more an economic history analysis of nuclear power diffusion. You see the result on the left side. You see that this is how the reactors diffused around the world. You can clearly see 2 ways. On the left side, the yellow way, the US way, which was a liberal way on selling reactor technologies, also licenses. And on the right side, you see that Russia or the former Soviet Union on their side kept the reactor technologies for themselves and only built turnkey reactors. So what's quite striking is that none of these reactors have been developed on what we call nowadays economic grounds. This means a decision of a private investor in the context of a market-based competitive economic system. And this area now, what the fourth period post-Fukushima, is actually characterized by the implosion of nuclear power in Western economies. We have the closures of reactors well before their lifetime, their extended lifetimes, and even new build projects have been abandoned, which has always been the case in nuclear power construction, but this was also the case most recently in the US. So what makes nuclear power quite unique compared, for example, to PV or wind, that we don't have like a learning curve, a learning effect. Nuclear power has always been characterized by high construction costs. Here in this graph, you see in blue dots, this is the US construction costs. Those are not the levelized costs, which we heard before, but those are the overnight construction costs. So the cost per kilowatt of installed capacity. You can see quite clearly that they exploded in the US from $1,500 per kilowatt to nearly $9,000 per kilowatt of capacity. On the low side, you see the French costs, which are lower, but nonetheless they quite also escalated a little bit. I can really recommend this paper, which it's based on from Wealer 2010. And he puts it this way, that the historical low costs in France illustrate the different institutional settings. We have in France, of course, a very close connection between the regulatory agency. It's a state-owned company that builds reactors. And this is also, if you look at today, where constructions are done in South Korea or in China, where we also have like this close connection between the state and nuclear company. This could also be a reason why we observe some lower costs in China and Korea. Looking back at economic literature, we did a review on economic literature since the 50s. I just cited here some of the most important ones, the MIT, the University of Chicago, but also Davis. And it's quite surprising that no one ever pretended nuclear power was economic. I really like the quote of Davis in his paper, Prospects for Nuclear Power, which was published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which is a quite high-ranking journal. And he said, even 70 years after Enrico Fermi demonstrated that electricity could be generated using nuclear fission, the industry is still trying to demonstrate how this can be scaled up cheaply enough to compete with coal and natural gas. So even 70 years later, the industry is not competitive with coal and gas. And I'm not even talking about renewables at this point. So what are the trends today? We have these are the following slides are from the current World Nuclear Industry Status Report 2020, which is available online for free. On the left side, we see that the nuclear electricity production from the 80s until today peaked. It peaked the electricity production in 2006. And on the right side, you see the same graph, but in yellow, you see China, and the others is the rest of the world. So outside of China, world nuclear production has declined, although in China it increases. Also, what's important is to remember that nuclear share worldwide peaked in the 90s, mid-90s in 1996, and is today only around 10% of global electricity production comes from nuclear. If you look at the primary energy consumption, it's even lower. It's around 4.4 to 5% of global primary energy consumption comes from nuclear sources. Here you can see the reactor startups and the closures in the world. And again, it's all again with China to show that the most of construction reactor startups are currently in Asia. It peaked in the 70s and in the 80s, and today it represents only a fraction of the reactor startups that it once had in the early diffusion years. This is quite small, but on the left side you see the terawatt hours of production of nuclear. Two countries, the US and France, two major nuclear countries, account for nearly half of total electricity production from nuclear sources. China is always brought up as investing heavily in nuclear, but on the right side you see the percentage of nuclear share in the electricity mix, and China is very at the bottom of the list with around 4 to 5% only of global electricity production coming from nuclear. What's also interesting is that you have here the historic maximum, and you see that declining in a lot of countries, the production, but also the share. So it's a downward path currently for nuclear. So to get more into the economics, let's first start with the demand side, or who is constructing. Here you see a list of all the countries that are currently constructing nuclear power plants in 2020. It's also from the World Nuclear Status Report. And we see that 52 reactors are currently built. 15 of those are in China, 7 in India, 4 in South Korea, and United Arab Emirates has 4 constructions, also 4 reactors in the constructions, the 4 which are done for the first time with South Korea. Nuclear power is always characterized by increasing costs, but also on long construction times. Here on the right side, you see from the number of plants which are already behind schedule at the moment. From 52, around 33 are already behind schedule. There's also one power plant which is in construction since the 70s, although construction here was stopped multiple times. It's also interesting to note, to look at the countries which invest, which are nuclear newcomers, which are constructing for the first time nuclear power plants. And these are, as I mentioned, the United Arab Emirates, this is Belarus, this is Turkey, and this is Bangladesh. Here you see the capacity which is currently built. And looking at the supply side, which is interesting, is that KEPCO is building in the United Arab Emirates. This is the first construction project outside of their own country. So it's interesting to see how this will develop from a point of view of cost, but also construction duration. And the rest is supplied by Rosatom. Rosatom is the major supplier nowadays. It has an interesting tool, which I'm going to talk about later on. It not only provides the technology, but also the financing. Here on the right side, you see some data on the financing. For Belarus and Bangladesh, 90% of all the money for the reactor came by Russian loans. For Turkey too, Rosatom is part of the company. It owns 51% shares, and we also have here a regulatory scheme. 50% of the electricity will be remunerated at a high guaranteed price per megawatt hour. So going more into detail on the supply side, first of all, I just want to show, if you're talking about future investments, we are talking about generation 3 or generation 3 plus reactors, which are currently being built in Europe and in Asia too. The majority of the current fleet is second generation reactors, and those reactors, the third generation, have, among others, an improved thermal efficiency. They're supposed to be more standardized. They have longer lifetimes of up to 60 years. And even third generation plus designs are supposed to have a core catcher. They are supposed to withstand aircraft impacts after 9/11. So this is a technology, when we're talking about future investments, where we should look closely. So where are they operational? They're operational in China, in India, in Iran, and only 24 reactors are currently connected to the grid. This represents only 7% of the current operational capacity. Again, the majority is supplied by Rosatom. And in early 2020, only China and Russia operate the more advanced third generation reactors. The average construction time increased from 4 years in Japan, where the first reactor was connected to the grid over 20 years ago, to 13 years in India. And we have an average construction time of 8.7 years. So what's more interesting is that not one third generation reactor was completed in the Western economies. They're currently being built in France, in Flamanville 3, in Finland, Olkiluoto 3, 2 in the UK, and 2 in the US. Here on the second last column, you see the original planned date when it's supposed to be finished, the construction project, and you see the current estimate. So initial construction durations of around 5 years increased in some cases threefold. We have here on the right side the cost estimations. They increased also by 25% to even 370%. Which I mentioned in the beginning, in the US, we had 2 Westinghouse AP1000 reactors, which started in 2013. There were 4 years of construction, and then the project was abandoned in 2017, leaving a large bill which has to be paid by the taxpayer. And here in the Western economies, the major supplier is France, Rosatom. Here on the graph, you see the overall construction costs again, and all the estimates which are done by the International Energy Agency, the Nuclear Energy Agency from the OECD, basically all the literature. And the estimates are always between 4,000 and 6,000. And on the right side, you see the current construction projects, Olkiluoto 3, Flamanville 3, with their initial cost estimates in black and the current cost increase in red. So you see that construction costs had increased largely and are way over the real construction costs at the ground are much higher than the ones that are estimated by the literature, which also often go into the models then. So looking more at the reactor vendors, because if you talk about nuclear power as a climate solution, it's always also important to ask who is going to construct these reactors at all. So the majority is situated currently in Asia and former Soviet Union countries. We have on the right side, you see this from 2017. There were 44 projects under construction, and you see that Rosatom had 1/3 of the share of the market share, followed by China, and then by Korea, and only then Westinghouse and Framatome. What's striking is that only the US and Japan are the only two countries where privately owned companies construct reactors. The top three reactor vendor countries are Russia, China, and Korea, which own over 70% of the world market, and they are all three state-owned companies from a more centralized planning and less market-oriented economic system. Again, we have to hear this close utility regulatory agency connection. This facilitates exports too. We see this for Russia, as I mentioned, with getting loans to the companies who want to build reactors. Korea, KEPCO did some sort of this too for the United Arab Emirates, and this is what I mean with both Russia and China provide a strong government-backed package, including financing as a policy tool. So, based on all this information on long construction time, the costs which are uncertain, we wanted to ask, okay, what does it mean if you invest into a third generation nuclear power plant? So we asked the question, what can a private investor expect when he invests into third generation nuclear power plant? For this, we focused on the perspective of a private investor and Western economies, because we wanted to exclude this non-market context, where the data quality it makes it quite difficult to handle the cost from China and Russia. For this, we employed a Monte Carlo simulation technique. This means we have uncertain factors which are going to take into account the variety of parameters. Let's show you already the main findings. We even excluded decommissioning and waste management, and again, even with excluding this cost, an investor would generate a lot of losses. Longer lifetimes by new reactor designs is also no game changer. Yeah, going to show you the cost that we put into the Monte Carlo simulation. I'm not going to go into detail. Just here, these parameters are uncertain. We have the cost for constructing power plant. We estimate a range between 4,000 and 9,000. So we even exclude the high costs, for example, at the Vogtle station in the US. The wholesale price of electricity is uncertain. Here we estimate 20 to 80 US dollars per megawatt hour. We have the weighted average cost of capital between 4 and 10%. And we did this for two construction periods. One where it's very optimistic that we could build a power plant in 5 years, or we could, like more realistic, like Olkiluoto or Flamanville, when it's going onto the grid, it will be 15 years of construction. Here you see the results. I'm not going into the detail. It's start on the left side. You see the construction. When we use 5 years of construction, you see that on the left side you see the probability. In fact, it means that just it's a very high chance that the investor will end with around a net present value of minus $5 billion. If you have 15 years of construction, it even looks low. It looks worse. Could be to up to minus $10 billion of losses. But if one of my major focuses is on research is decommissioning. So I want to show the other perspectives of perspectives of nuclear and issues. Also from the current World Nuclear Industry Status Report, decommissioning has already come up here in this conference. We identified for the World Nuclear Industry Status Report the decommissioned reactors worldwide, and we only found 10 to 20 fully decommissioned reactors. Here in this graph are all the 20 reactors which have been released from regulatory control. Then in light blue, you see the construction duration, in blue, the operating time, and in brown, the decommissioning time. And there are even some cases where decommissioning takes longer than construction and operation combined. If you look at decommissioning, even what we are talking about the normal reactors, it's 1 gigawatt large-scale reactor over 1 gigawatt, 1.6 for the EPR, with 40 years of operation is non-existent. We found also some costs. which have a high variance. We have very cheap costs because, for example, it's in the US, it's 280 per kilowatt, but up to 1,500 too. Germany, even we have some cases, Grundremmingen A, up to 10,000 euro per kilowatt. All this cost leads to underestimation of costs and increases, of course, the funding risks. And in most cases, decommissioning of the oldest reactors, like in the UK and France, faces particular technical, organizational, financial challenges, and which have in some cases not even started. So constructing new power plants, we do also have to take into perspective the decommissioning. Not only decommissioning, but still there's not one geological disposal facility on operation worldwide. You see all the programs listed in the World Nuclear Waste Report of 2019. There's not one operational yet. This leads to large amounts of spent fuel stored across the country. For instance, here also from the World Nuclear Waste Report, about 81%. We have 6,000 tons of spent fuel stored across Europe, and 80% of this is stored in water, which also raises high risks. So I come already to my conclusion. So what are the main findings? Nuclear power as a climate solution. Looking back, economics never played a role in nuclear power diffusion. It was always highly subsidized. There were a lot of state companies. The nuclear power sector has historically struggled with ever-increasing costs. And to this day, we have no technological improvements or potential learning effects that materialize in cost reductions. From my point of view, nuclear power is no object for rapid decarbonization, especially to the very long construction times. If you imagine we have to decarbonize by 2050, and in Europe it's taking currently up to 15 years to construct one reactor, it's quite, from the time scale, quite impossible. The investments into third generation reactors results in very large losses. And which is more importantly, who is going to build these reactors? The traditional reactor vendors are in financial turmoil. We have Westinghouse, which filed for bankruptcy. The French Framatome had to be bailed out by several billions by the French state to survive. And China and Russia have become the major suppliers. So from my point of view, looking ahead, attention should be paid to the unresolved issues of decommissioning and waste management, and not into investing into new reactors. So here are some references from our research group, which this presentation is based on. Some further references which are quite important: the MIT, the Davis report, and that's from my part. Thank you very much for listening to me.